I didn't say a word when it happened. That's the part people find hardest to believe when I tell this story, that a man can stand in the place he built with his own two hands, in front of everyone he has ever loved, and simply go quiet. Not from fear. Not from shame. From something that took me 65 years to learn, and that I refuse to call anything other than what it is. Certainty. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where it actually started, which wasn't the night of the party. It started 38 years before that. On a Tuesday morning in October, when I handed a check I could barely afford to a man named Stu Granger, in exchange for a failing lunch counter on the corner of Birchwood and 5th in Claremont, Ohio. The place was a disaster. The grill hadn't been properly cleaned since the Nixon administration. The linoleum was the color of old teeth. There were 3 stools with cracked vinyl, and a sign in the window that said open but felt like a lie. My wife, Margaret, walked through that door behind me, looked around for a long moment, and then put her hand in mine. She didn't say it was going to be fine. She wasn't that kind of woman. She said, "Well, we better get started." That was Margaret. No wasted words. We named it Birchwood Diner, which was not creative but was honest. And in those early years, honesty was the only currency we had. I worked the grill from 5 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon. Margaret handled everything else, the books, the orders, the regulars who came in and needed someone to listen to them almost as much as they needed the coffee. We had our daughter, Claire, in 1981, and by the time she was 4 years old, she could take an order on a notepad and carry a plate of eggs without spilling them. I used to joke that she learned to walk in the diner. That wasn't far from the truth. By the time Claire was in high school, Birchwood had become something. Not famous, nothing like that. But it was the kind of place a town grows around. The high school football team came after Friday games. Farmers came at dawn before the sun was fully up. On Saturday mornings, every stool was taken, and there was a line out the door into the cold. Margaret and I had paid off the building by 1999. We owned it outright. The deed was in a safety deposit box at First Community Bank, and I thought about it sometimes the way you think about a thing that you love but have stopped being afraid of losing. Margaret passed in 2014. Pancreatic cancer. 8 weeks from diagnosis to the last morning, I sat beside her bed. I'm not going to say much about that because I still can't find the words that fit, and I've stopped trying to force them. What I will say is that after she was gone, Birchwood kept me alive. I don't mean that loosely. I mean it the way a man means it, when he has nothing else left that requires him to get up in the morning. And I had the diner. And so I got up. Claire met Derek in 2016 at some kind of professional conference in Columbus. He was in commercial real estate. He had good manners when he wanted to, and a way of talking that made you feel like the most important person in the room. I didn't distrust him. Not then. I'm not a man who distrusts without reason, but I noticed things. Small things. The way he looked around the diner the first time Claire brought him in, not like a man looking at his girlfriend's family history, but like a man looking at square footage. The way he asked about the building's assessed value that Thanksgiving, slipping it in between questions about the stuffing and the football score, like it was nothing. The way, when I answered, he nodded just a half-second too long, I noticed. But I said nothing, because Claire loved him, and because I am a man who has learned to tell the difference between a bad feeling and a fact. They got married in June of 2018. Nice ceremony. Outdoor, at a vineyard, about 40 minutes outside of town. I walked my daughter down the aisle, and when I gave her hand to Derek, I looked at him the way a father looks at a man in that moment. And he smiled at me, and I smiled back, and that was that. 6 months after the wedding, Derek came to me with what he called an investment opportunity, a property development project south of Columbus, mixed-use retail, apartment units. Projected return of 30% in under 3 years. He was very polished about it. Had a prospectus and everything, printed and bound. He needed $50,000 to get his share of the stake to the minimum threshold. He wanted to know if I would contribute half. I told him I'd think about it. I thought about it for 3 days. And at the end of those 3 days, I loaned him $25,000. Not as an investment, as a loan, with a written agreement, signed by both of us. Claire called me that night and thanked me, and I told her to stop thanking me and ask me about the diner, which she did. And we talked for almost an hour. The development project, as it turned out, moved slowly. Derek was always about 6 months from a payout that never quite arrived. There was a second request. Smaller $8,000 for something he described as a bridge cost. I gave him 6 and wrote up another note. A third request came the following spring. I told Claire privately, not to put pressure on him, just gently, that the repayment schedule we had agreed to was not being met. She said she would talk to him. Things were quiet after that for a while. In early 2023, I decided it was time. I was 64 years old. My right knee ached in cold weather. I had a good manager in Ray Kowalski, who had been with me for 11 years and knew the diner better than anyone except me. I told Ray I wanted to start planning a real exit, something gradual, something that would protect the staff and the regulars and the culture of the place. Ray nodded and said, "About time." We talked for 2 hours at the counter after closing on a Wednesday. By the end of the conversation, I had the beginning of a plan. I also made an appointment with a man named Gerald Worth, an estate and business attorney whose father had eaten at Birchwood every morning for 20 years. Gerald was careful, methodical, and did not tell me what I wanted to hear. He told me what was true. We spent 3 sessions going over the best structure for transitioning the diner in a way that protected its future and honored what Margaret and I had built. I will not go into the details of what we decided, because those details matter to what comes later in this story, and I need you to understand them in the right order. The retirement party was Claire's idea. She called me in August, about 5 months before my 65th birthday, and said she wanted to throw me a proper send-off. At the diner, the real place, with the real people, the regulars, the long-time staff, some folks from town who had been coming since the beginning. I told her it felt excessive. She told me to stop being stubborn. I told her she sounded exactly like her mother. She went quiet for a second and then said, very softly, "Good." And so we planned the party. It was set for the second Saturday in January. My actual birthday is the 9th, which in Ohio is about as brutal a time of year as you can find, but that diner was built for January, the lights inside against the dark and the cold, the smell of coffee and something always on the grill. We closed to the public for the evening. Claire handled the invitations. Ray and his wife handled the food. About 80 people came. I want you to understand what that room felt like that night. I want you to understand it because what happened inside it is not the whole story, and I don't want the ugliness to be the only thing you take away. 80 people in a diner that seats 60 meant it was warm and crowded and loud in the best way. People I hadn't seen in years came. A woman named Dorothy Fassbender, who had been one of our first regulars back in 1987, came with her daughter. Ray gave a speech that made me laugh, and then made me cry, and then made everyone laugh at me for crying. Claire stood up and talked about growing up in that kitchen, and I had to look at the ceiling for a while. Derek stood beside her during the speech. He had a glass of wine in his hand and he was smiling, and if I had looked only at his face, I might have thought he was a man genuinely happy for his wife and her father. But I had developed, over the course of many years, a habit of not looking only at faces. I noticed his eyes moving. I noticed the way he tilted his head toward a man I didn't recognize at the edge of the room. A man who was standing rather than sitting, and who had not, to my knowledge, been invited. I filed it away. Dinner moved along. People came up to the counter where I was sitting to shake my hand or hug me or tell me a story about the diner that I hadn't heard before or hadn't thought about in years. An older farmer named Cal Briggs told me about the morning in 1994 that he'd come in with a broken-down tractor and $300 to his name and sat at the counter for 4 hours while he waited on a parts delivery, and Margaret had kept his coffee refilled without saying a word about it. He said that morning was the one that kept him going. I had not known that story. I held on to it. It was around 9 o'clock, about 40 minutes before I had planned to say my own few words and send everyone home happy, when Derek stood up. He didn't ask for quiet. He just stood, and the way he stood was different from the way a man stands to make a toast. He was holding a manila folder, and he was not smiling anymore. and the man at the edge of the room whom I did not recognize moved slightly closer to the center. "I want to take a moment," Derek said, loudly enough that conversation stopped, "to talk about the future of Birchwood." The room got quiet, not the warm quiet that falls when someone is about to say something meaningful. The other kind. I set down my coffee. Derek said that transitions were complicated. He said that businesses had real value that needed to be protected and properly structured. He said that a diner like Birchwood, sitting on a corner property that had appreciated significantly in 38 years, was not just a sentimental object but a serious asset. He said these things in the same tone of voice he had used in that meeting in 2018 with the prospectus. Smooth and even, and just formal enough to make you feel like you were in a meeting you hadn't agreed to attend. Then he opened the folder and slid a document across the counter toward me. "I need you to sign this tonight," he said. "It's a property transfer agreement. Everything goes into a joint family trust. Claire and I would manage it going forward, which just makes sense given the circumstances. 64 people I had known for years or decades were looking at me. I looked at the document. I did not pick it up. I looked at Derek. "No," I said. The room was completely still. Derek's jaw tightened. Just slightly. He said that I was being emotional, which was understandable, and that I should take a moment to think about what this meant for Claire's future and the stability of the family. He said the document was professionally prepared. He said he had brought someone tonight who could notarize it on the spot, which is when I understood who the man at the edge of the room was. "I understand what you're saying," I told him. "The answer is no." Something changed in Derek's face then. It was not the mask slipping, exactly. It was more like watching a man decide to stop pretending he was wearing one. He came around the counter. He came close enough that I could smell the wine on his breath, and he put his hand on my arm, not gently, and he said, quietly enough that only the people nearest to us could hear, "You're going to sign it, because if you don't, I promise you, you will lose this place in a way that is much worse than this." I looked at his hand on my arm. "Take your hand off me," I said. He didn't. What happened next happened fast. I have replayed it in my mind many times, and I still cannot entirely explain what Derek thought he was accomplishing. He shoved me, not a push, a shove, both hands, hard enough that I stumbled back against the counter and knocked over a coffee mug that shattered on the floor, in a room of 80 people, in a building I had owned for 38 years, in front of Dorothy Fassbender and Cal Briggs and Ray Kowalski and my daughter. The silence that followed was the kind you could feel in your chest. Claire made a sound I had not heard from her since she was a small girl. I steadied myself against the counter. I looked at my son-in-law. I looked at the document still lying there on the counter. I looked out at the room, all those faces. Some shocked, some horrified. 2 or 3 of the men already half risen from their seats. And then I buttoned my jacket. I picked up my phone from the counter. I walked toward the door at the back of the diner, the one that leads out to the parking lot, the one I had walked through 10,000 times over 38 years. Ray moved toward me. I shook my head slightly, and he stopped. I pushed through the door into the cold. January in Claremont is honest the way very few things are honest. It does not pretend to be anything other than what it is. The cold hit me, and I stood in the parking lot in my good shirt, and I looked up at a sky that had no stars in it, and I breathed in and out twice, and then I scrolled to a contact in my phone that I had saved under the name Gerald W. Gerald picked up on the second ring. I told him what had just happened. Not all of it, just the essential facts, the document, the demand, the shove. There was a pause on the line. Then Gerald said something that I will not repeat verbatim, because Gerald is a careful lawyer and was careful even in that moment. But the substance of what he said was that Derek had made, in front of approximately 80 witnesses, a series of very serious errors. I said I was aware of that. Gerald said that there was something I needed to know. He had been meaning to call me that week. He said that in the process of completing the trust documentation we had been working on, he had discovered something while doing routine title work. Derek had, approximately 14 months prior, attempted to use the Birchwood property as collateral for a private loan. He had submitted paperwork to a private lending firm that included a forged signature mine on a document purporting to grant him co-ownership interest in the property. I stood in the parking lot and I was quiet for a moment. How far did it get? I asked. Gerald said the loan had not been finalized. The lending firm had flagged an inconsistency in the documentation, and the application had stalled. But the paperwork existed, and it bore a signature that was not mine, I said. Call your contact at the county prosecutor's office, Gerald said. I've already looked up the number. I stayed on the phone with him for about 11 minutes. By the time I came back inside, the party had effectively ended. Most people had gotten their coats and were saying quiet goodbyes, the kind of goodbyes that happen when something ugly has interrupted something good and no one is quite sure what to say. The man with the notary stamp had gone. Derek was standing near the front window with his arms crossed, and when he saw me come through the back door, he straightened up, and I could see him trying to read my expression. I gave him nothing to read. Claire was sitting at the counter. She was not crying, but she had been. She looked up when I came in, and I could see in her face all the things she was trying to sort out, the loyalty and the shame and the confusion, and something deeper underneath all of it that I recognized because I had seen it in her. Mother's face, too. In harder moments, the capacity for honesty, even when honesty hurts. I sat down beside her on the stool next to hers. She said, "Dad." I said, "I know." She said, "I didn't know he was going to do that. I want you to know that. I didn't know about the document, or any of it." I looked at her, and I told her I believed her. And I did. I do. Claire is not her husband. She never has been. Derek came over. He had managed to reassemble some version of his composure, and he said something about how things had gotten out of hand, and he thought we should all take some time to cool off and talk rationally in the morning. He said this in the voice of a man who believes that time and distance are always in his favor. I looked up at him. "Gerald Worth is making some calls tonight," I said. "I thought you should know." Derek's face did something complicated. He said, "What kind of calls?" I said, "The kind that happen when someone forges another man's signature on a loan document and uses a property they don't own as collateral." The color left his face in a way I have never seen happen to a person so completely and so quickly. He looked at Claire, and then back at me, and then at the door, and I watched something disintegrate behind his eyes. The whole careful structure of calculation and confidence. All of it, gone in the space of about 4 seconds. Claire looked at her husband. She asked him very quietly if it was true. He didn't answer. That was its own kind of answer. I am not going to dramatize what happened between Derek and Claire after that, because what happened between them was theirs, not mine, and because my daughter's pain is not a story I have the right to perform. What I will say is that she called me the next morning from her sister-in-law's house, where she had gone to stay, and we talked for a long time, and at the end of the conversation she said she was sorry, and I told her that she had nothing to be sorry for, and she said that she felt like she did, and I said that feeling was a different thing from fact, and she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You sound like Mom." I told her that was the finest thing anyone had said to me in years. Gerald moved quickly. He was in contact with the county prosecutor's office by Monday morning. The forgery matter is not mine to detail. It is in the hands of people whose job it is to handle such things, and I have complete confidence that it will be handled. What I can tell you is that Derek's professional circumstances have changed considerably in recent months, and the investment project south of Columbus, which never did produce that 30% return, has attracted some additional scrutiny from people with badges and the patience to go through records carefully. Birchwood Diner had its last official day of business under my direct management on the last Saturday of February, 6 weeks after the party. I am not going to tell you it was easy to walk out of there that night, because it wasn't. Ray was there, and Dorothy Fassbender came in one more time, and I made coffee for the last time at the grill I had worked for 38 years and handed it to her, and she took it with both hands the way she always had and said, "This is the best cup of coffee I have ever had in my life," which she says every single time, and which I love her for. But I want to be precise about what closing that chapter actually meant, because it is not the ending some people expect. Birchwood did not close. The lights are still on. The sign in the window still says open, and this time it is not a lie. The structure Gerald and I built during those 3 careful sessions took effect the 1st of March. Birchwood Diner is now held in a trust, not a family trust controlled by anyone with Derek's last name, but a properly structured arrangement with Ray Kowalski as the operational manager, with employment protections for every member of the staff who has been there more than 3 years, and with a specific provision that the building and the business are to remain a working diner for a minimum of 20 years. The name does not change. The hours do not change. The coffee is the same. I retained a life interest in the property, which means that if anyone ever tries to transfer or encumber or liquefy what I built, they will first have to explain themselves to Gerald Worth. And Gerald is, as I have mentioned, a very careful man. Claire came back to Claremont in April. She has her own attorney now, a woman from Columbus, she found herself. Someone sharp and no nonsense. The process she is going through is not easy, and she does not need me to say that it will be, because she is Margaret's daughter, and she has never needed to be protected from the truth. What she needs is what I have been able, these past several months, to actually give her not a signature on a document, not a deed or a title or a transfer of assets, but the thing I should have understood was the only inheritance that ever mattered. I told her this past Sunday, when she came for breakfast and sat at the counter the way she used to when she was 7 years old, and the diner was just opening, and the whole day was ahead of us. I told her that the best thing I ever built was not the diner. She said, "Dad, don't." I said, "I mean it." She looked at me for a long moment with her mother's eyes, and she said, very quietly, "I know you do." We sat at the counter for 2 hours. Ray brought us eggs and coffee and didn't say much, because Ray understands rhythm. Outside, January had finally let go, and the street was gray and clean. A couple of the regulars came in and took their usual stools and nodded at me, and I nodded back. I did not raise my voice. Not that night in January when Derek shoved me in front of 80 people. Not the morning after when Gerald told me about the forged documents. Not any of the mornings since. I have been asked, by more than one person who was there that night, how I stayed so calm, what I was thinking when I walked out the back door, whether I was scared or angry or just numb. I was none of those things. I was a 64-year-old man walking out the back door of a building I had paid for, to make a phone call I had every right to make, because I had spent 38 years doing things the right way. And the right way has a way of holding. Margaret taught me that. She taught me that the night we bought the lunch counter from Stu Granger, when she looked around at that broken-down room and put her hand in mine, she wasn't telling me it was going to be fine. She was telling me something more important than that. She was telling me that the work was the thing, the showing up, the doing it right, the building of something that would stand after you stopped holding it up. I understood that then in the way you understand a thing that your body knows before your mind catches up. I understand it now in the way you understand a thing that has been tested. The morning light comes into Birchwood the same way it always has, through the windows on the east side, long and pale and clean in January, and warm as honey in July. I come in sometimes on Tuesday mornings when it's quiet. I sit at the counter. Ray brings me coffee without my asking. I don't own it the way I used to. I don't run it. My name is not on the door and never was. But the coffee is still the best in Claremont, and the counter is level, and the light comes in the same way every morning. That's mine. No one can put that in a folder and slide it across a counter. No one has ever been able to take the thing I actually built